Taxes are going up in October, and we just got our clearest sign yet. According to new analysis from the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, the government is going to miss its own fiscal rules by £50 billion. Let's get into it. But let's first lay the scene. Barely 6 months ago, the Office for Budget Responsibility said that the UK government by 2030 was going to have a buffer of £9.9 billion. This specifically covers their day-to-day spending and was called their fiscal headroom. But in less than 4 months, we've gone from 9.9 billion in the green to 41.9 billion in the red. But how did we get here? So firstly, we have the government's decision to reverse its cuts to winter fuel payments. That's about £1.5 billion the government had hoped to save but now won't. Then there's the welfare reforms. It couldn't get past its own party. That's £13.7 billion disappeared. There's higher than expected spending. This is largely due to interest on government debt. That's £14.3 billion. But then we get to the big one, the frankly elephant in the room that they just cannot seem to avoid, which is weaker than expected growth. That's expected to wipe out £22.2 billion. Now, this is doubly important because more growth means more tax revenues, which gives them more room to play with and to try and shrink this £41 billion gap. This was made an absolutely central feature of the government's campaign promises, and I think it's safe to say that they're not delivering. But there's a lot to go through here. And as you can see, this forecast is consistently lower than the Office for Budget Responsibility, which has traditionally been more optimistic than a lot of the other forecasters out there. So how could the government restore their fiscal headroom? What are some of the levers that they can pull? This has been something which has plagued the UK economy pretty much since the financial crisis. So whilst this isn't a new problem, Labour had promised to bring a fresh perspective to it and to really do everything they could to juice the numbers. So far, it's not really worked. We should also add that there are important external caveats. There are things like the trade war, which Donald Trump has launched, which has been a real headwind for growth, not just in the UK, but around the world. There's increased global uncertainty with conflicts going on left, right and centre, which will all disrupt trade. So whilst there are definitely some economic headwinds going on globally, there are definitely some policy missteps. But let's start with an area where the UK economy has done historically very badly, which is investment. Now, investment can be split into two. You have public investment, which the government does, and private investment, which the private markets do. Now, take a look at this here. You can see in the blue line, we've got actual business investment, and then in the pink line, we've got the 2009 to 2015 trend. And you can see that in a post-Brexit world, business investment has just collapsed. Presumably, this is something the government had hoped would start to pick up once we started to get more global trade deals in place, but this just hasn't seemed to materialise. We've also got this graph here where the UK is here in pink. And again, compared to the rest of the G7, the UK has historically not done too well here. So frankly, does the government just need to go out and spend a load of money? Well, the short answer is, to some degree, yes. And that's for one key reason, that investment drives productivity. And productivity in the UK economy has been one of the fundamental flaws, something which we have just never, ever recovered from since the financial crisis and has only got worse since Brexit. Just take a look here to get a better idea of what I'm talking about. You can see that the UK has just done so poorly for such a long time. But what does productivity really mean? Productivity is basically the amount of output that a single worker can generate in a given year. And it has been one of the fundamental drivers pretty much since the Industrial Revolution that has powered economic growth in virtually every country around the world since the dawn of the Industrial Age. But with flatlining productivity, this has meant that wages are stagnant, that GDP has barely grown. So what are some ways that the government could improve productivity? Part of the money that could be spent on things like infrastructure, public transport, broadband, giving companies incentives to invest, all of those sorts of things help to boost productivity. But there are also other things. Looking at the cost of childcare, you hear of plenty of people who don't bother going back to work because after they take out childcare from their after-tax income, it's barely worth it. So that's another key area. And you can go down and down and down the list of things where if the UK could be more productive, then it would be an absolute boon to the UK economy. And take a look at this graph here. We can see output per hour worked, which is our productivity. We've got the 1990 to 2007 trend in the pink, and then the 2010 to 2019 trend in blue. And you can see after the financial crisis, it does just completely flatline. And this is really the sort of thing that we're talking about. And take a look here. Productivity is absolutely correlated with higher wages. So how do wages and productivity link to one another? Well, if a single worker is more productive, that increases their marginal productivity. That is effectively the value that they add through their job. If this increases, then it makes them more worthwhile to the employer. Increased competition for skilled labour helps to bid up wages. and businesses are more profitable due to higher productivity, then they have more money to be able to spend on their employees. Higher wages can therefore improve living standards, and workers can afford to go out and spend more money on goods and services. So you can see that there is this perpetual cycle within the economy where productivity is absolutely at the forefront, absolutely at the cutting edge or the tip of the spear of improving the UK economy. But all of this is made so much more difficult when investment rates in the UK are as horrendous as they are. But we should also point out that it doesn't necessarily need to be that the government needs to go out and spend money on big infrastructure projects or anything like that. There are reforms that they can do. There's things like tax breaks for training or upskilling their employees. They can reduce taxes on productive investments, things like capital gain and business investment relief. They can also look at helping improve talent mobility. This is a topic which we'll come on to next. So now we've covered growth and just a small fraction of the policies that the government could look at here. And how can we make the tax system work better? Not necessarily raising taxes on people, not necessarily increasing taxes, but how can we make the tax code work better for people? Now, I think we should also point out that the tax take in the UK at the moment is at kind of historical highs. But are there things that the government could do to not necessarily tax the average person more, but to make taxes work better? Let's dive into some of these. One of the reasons why the tax take at the moment is so high is because so many thresholds have been frozen pretty much since COVID under the Conservatives and under Labour to try and bring in more revenue. One of the key ways that they've been able to try and do this is by freezing tax thresholds, the personal allowance, inheritance tax thresholds. All of these sorts of things mean that as people's income and as their assets grow over time, more and more people end up paying a higher marginal rate of tax. Just take a look at this. The number of higher rate UK taxpayers is expected to hit more than 7 million this year. Frozen tax thresholds mean an extra 500,000 people to be taxed at 40% on some income in 2025 to 2026. But we should also point out that it's not just reserved for higher rate taxpayers. The share of adults paying higher rates has increased enormously in recent decades. In 1991 to 1992, just 3.5% of UK adults paid the 40% higher rate income tax. By 2022 to 2023, 11% were paying higher rates, with that figure set to reach 14% by 2027 to 2028. So the government could look at readdressing some of these to make the tax take a bit more equitable. Now let's look at council tax. This is, if you wanted to make the worst tax imaginable, the most regressive, most unfair tax, you could not create it in a lab, in a test tube to be this crap. But let's look at why it is such an unfair and regressive tax. And just to really illustrate what I mean, Buckingham Palace, a property that is valued at between £3 and £5 billion, pays £1,878 per year in council tax. I, in this house, which I'm filming in right now, pay about twice that in council tax. So immediately, right off the bat, that feels, that's not ideal. That doesn't feel like a super fair system. But let's really dive into why that's the case. We covered this in a previous video, that in Blackburn, one of the most deprived areas in the UK, the average council tax bill is equivalent to about 1.1% of the value of that house every single year. If you go to some parts of central London, like Westminster, it's more like 0.1% of the value of the property is paid in council tax every single year. So what we immediately see is some of the most deprived areas in the UK spend a greater proportion of their income on council tax when compared to people in some of the unbelievably rich parts of the UK. And a study by the Resolution Foundation found that the poorest fifth spend 3 times their share of income on council tax compared with the richest fifth, 4.8% versus 1.5%. So how could they fix council tax? So we've already outlined why council tax is so rubbish, but what could they really do to fix it? They could look at changing some of the bands. They could add more bands, say at 500, a million, 5 million, 10 million, 100 million. That would go some way to solving the problem. They could stop using the 1991 valuations of a house, which is just, we could be living in the year 4000 underwater and they would still be using those valuations. It is a truly absurd system. Now, we should also point out that this does lead to 2 kind of big problems, which is that people who have bought houses a long time ago, which are now worth materially more, and maybe they're retired, are going to get a bigger bill. So there's stuff that you should do there for people who are retired or on lower incomes. Absolutely no doubt about that. But what it would also mean is that councils in very rich areas would be absolutely swimming in cash, and councils in poor areas would have much fewer financial resources to call on. But we should also point out that councils get somewhere about half of their income every single year from council tax. The rest of it they get from central government. So they could still do this, but then the government might just change the formula that they use centrally in order to make sure that authorities are getting the money that they really need. The government could change council tax so it's just a single flat rate across the board on the value of the house. This would basically amount to a tax cut for those people in Blackburn and a tax increase to those people in Westminster. Insane. We can also look at VAT. VAT in the UK is an insanely complicated system. The IFS recalls this story about, of all things, Jaffa cakes. Any tax system that leads to thousands of hours and millions of pounds being spent on legal disputes over whether Jaffa cakes really are a cake, which is 0 rated, rather than chocolate-covered biscuits, which attracts 20% of VAT, is one that urgently needs reform. Each year that the current system stays in place means more time, money, and ingenuity wasted on such ludicrous disputes. VAT is an insanely complicated system. And again, there's stuff that the government could do here. They could scrap a load of the VAT exemptions and keep in some of the obvious ones. VAT on child's clothes, for example, seems perfectly reasonable, but just to make them way more clear-cut. They could then use this to reduce the overall rate of VAT, say from 20% down to 15% or potentially even lower. And again, it's not necessarily about raising more tax, it's about making a system that actually works. We should also look at personal taxes. This is absolutely something that we should be looking at. We covered in this video just here how the UK tax system is absolutely absurd, that despite the top line marginal income tax rate in the UK being 45%, that there are specific income sections where you can be paying 90+% in marginal income taxes. And if you have kids, it can be even more. That is just a ludicrous situation, where if you make between £100,000 and £125,000, you have a marginal tax rate of 62% or 69% if you're a graduate, assuming you have no kids. If you have kids, it's something like 20,000%. But if you earn over £125,000, then your marginal income tax drops to 47%. So again, whilst people might not be quick to break out the world's smallest violin for people who are making six figures, it does at least point and I think illustrate to a real problem in the UK tax code. Take a look at the high income child benefit charge. People who used to make between £50,000 and £60,000 would have some of their child benefit clawed back. The limit has now been increased slightly, but again, it points to a truly absurd tax system which is in rapid need of vast reform and overhaul. And again, this is not necessarily about taxing people more, but making the tax system work better and being more pro-growth. It is perfectly reasonable for people to say, the government already spends a lot, it plays a massive part in the economy, why would you want it to have an even bigger role in the economy? And that, I think, is a fair point. Until you look at some of this analysis from the CBI, this analysis clearly shows that one of the few effective ways to keep a lid on public debt increasing unsustainably is through productivity growth, that achieving these rates can only come through increased public and private investment. So you can see in this light blue line, we have low productivity at 0.5%, which is what it has historically been at for the last few years. We've got a baseline of 1.5% in this green colour. And then in yellow, we have higher productivity at 2.5% growth per year. And you can see that the debt to GDP ratio actually falls. In some of the low productivity scenarios, we're talking about debt to GDP of 6 times what we have at the moment. Now, we should also point out that there is zero doubt that Labour were handed a very bad economy from the Conservatives. Debt to GDP had steadily been increasing, public services had been absolutely gutted, public investment had completely cratered. And I think, frankly, that the biggest economic crime that Conservatives committed is that when interest rates for government-issued debt were very, 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 very low, they elected not to use that opportunity in some of the investments that we've been talking about. And so this really created an investment deficit across pretty much every aspect of the UK economy. This has meant that Labour is having to pick up a lot of those pieces, whether it's the RAC in schools or whether it's the 40 hospitals that were promised and all those sorts of things. But they're having to do so when the cost of government borrowing is absolutely stratospheric compared to where it was even just a couple of years ago. To put it in perspective, we now spend, I think it's north of £120 billion per year just on interest. If you've liked this video, please like and subscribe. We also have 2 videos on screen. We have this video about how the UK tax system stops you building wealth, this video here about some ISA tax changes, and this video just here about why £120,000 is the worst salary in the UK. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks very much for watching.